Hi, how's everyone doing today? It's kind of fun to discuss food after lunch. It kind of blows to talk about food when you're hungry. So this is a good time to discuss. My name is Kae Lani, and yeah, thanks so much for coming out today. And I always have to give a note to the Women's Travel Festival and say thanks because this organization had kind of an influence in igniting my career. My first ever travel conference was in 2015, the Women's Travel Conference back then. Or no, was it 2014? Oh my gosh, it was 2014. It's already been 5 years. 5 years flies by. But at my very first travel conference, I was just a blogger back then, and I wasn't even like a career blogger. I'd never really monetized my blog. I was barely freelancing. I'd never been on a press trip at that point, but I knew I wanted to break into travel writing. I just didn't know how. So I came to the Women's Travel Festival. I knew no one. I live in Philadelphia, so I took the train up, much like I did this morning. And yeah, I met a lot of amazing people there. Basically, the support system that got me to where I am today, which I am now a contributing food and travel editor with USA Today 10 Best. So 5-year journey. Yay, thanks. Yeah. So you never know who you're going to meet at these types of events or where you're going to go 5 years from now. Like I would have never expected being a food editor. But anyway, my nickname is the Miss Frizzle of food. And that's because I have been for a little over 3 years now researching the journey that food takes to get to the plate and tracking that journey as it crosses the world. And it's taken me to a lot of incredible places. Like last year I was on 4 continents researching food and the pathways that it takes and the cultural influences that, impact it. And I've gotten to do incredible things like forage with the Maori in New Zealand. I got the chance to, tour wine countries in North America and Europe. I've gotten the chance to interview fishermen in Mexico. And, I've met incredible people and farmers and food purveyors and chefs along the way. And I'm really I'm so fortunate to have those experiences. I do not take them for granted one bit. So with this work that I do, I've found myself in a really unique position where I'm helping a legacy media company reimagine how they cover food and reimagine how they discuss travel in the digital space primarily. And so some of the things that I'm going to be sharing with you today are my personal initiatives and the things that I've been able to implement with my team and some of the successes that we found along the way. And I hope that the freelancers in the room, that this talk can hopefully inspire you to think about food a little bit differently and to approach those stories from a different perspective. But also if there's any other editors in the room that maybe we should be leaving more space in our our editorial strategies for this type of storytelling, because it's going to be a group effort to advocate for more responsible food and travel journalism. So let's think about, what are your favorite food publications and what do you like about them? I did want to ask a few people in the room. Anyone? That's a question that's on the floor. This is an engaging talk. Bon appetit. Okay, why do you like Bon appetit? Good visuals. Okay. Yeah. They're really appetizing photos. What else? Anyone? Yes? The Pioneer Woman. What do you like about the Pioneer Woman?
Well, and local woman, so the local connection, but also the storytelling element of kind of how our family's woven into it in addition to sort of more traditional.
Okay, so how family is woven into traditional stories. Okay, that's, how food can kind of connect you with people. One more? Anyone else? Yes, Jill.
Lucky Peach.
Lucky Peach. I miss Lucky Peach. Yeah. Tell me why you like Lucky Peach.
I like the way the whole magazine is put together, visually, graphically. It's really focused on a lot of story.
Yes. So there, food can be discussed in a lot of different ways. And like you said, with Lucky Peach, it's visually and, the layout is stunning, but also the storytelling is really deep. Well, food can connect us to a lot of different topics of interest. Like if you're working at a newspaper, like food can actually pop up in like the lifestyle section in the form of recipes, in the form of meal plans, nutrition trends. It could pop up in the money section. Food is actually closely tied to economics, like corn, sugar, coffee, livestock even. These things are commodities that are traded publicly and are also on the stock market, but are also traded internationally and has to do with trade negotiations. So food can actually be in stories about politics. When 45 deregulates the USDA, that actually raises a lot of food concerns. Something that I'm personally exploring aside from my job with USA Today 10 Best is how climate change actually impacts food and how farmers have to adapt to changing climates. So food can actually help conceptualize all of these other topics that might be difficult for people to grasp. It can make economics, politics, the science of climate change a little bit more relatable to the average person. And so food can do the same with travel. And food is a really amazing way to connect to other cultures. It's a common ground to meet people that are different from you, but it can also conceptualize the history, the traditions, and the meaning behind a culture and their cuisine. So the conversation around food is changing for a multitude of reasons, primarily the digital environment. You've got social media that has, for legacy media companies, for, like the one I work with, it's very challenging. Many have seen it as like the final nail in the coffin to the print world. But really, like there's actually a lot of opportunities too, because social media has like really expanded the platforms as to like where, these stories can be told and how these stories can be told and where these stories live. And, it has created opportunities for bloggers and influencers. There's now opportunities like at legacy media companies like myself, who had found an opportunity to help with, creating digital products to help them adapt to the digital media landscape. There's also branded content, corporate blogs. There's like a lot of opportunities to share food stories. But one of the most interesting things that has really been like changing the way we as publishers have to think about food is the crowdsourcing websites, Yelp, TripAdvisor, Google reviews. These are things that are kind of answering the questions that traditional food and travel journalism used to answer. A lot of food traveling used to be like guidebook oriented, what to do, where to go, where to eat, where to stay. Those were questions that were answered by previous travel journalists in yesteryear. They were in guidebooks. People used to go to like Borders. Remember Borders? People used to go get guidebooks at Borders. I mean, I still like guidebooks, but for the most part, like there are some times where I'll travel to a new city, I'll plop my bags down in my Airbnb and I'll just like pull out my phone and be like, well, what am I in the mood for at this very second? And what's good around me, depending on people's reviews in the proximity of my Airbnb. So it's not to say that food coverage can't be the where to eat, what restaurants to go to. It's just that there is more competition on that level nowadays. And, a lot of people are finding those answers on social media. They're finding it on those crowdsourcing websites. So as like a publisher or as a food writer, how do you, where do we go from here? How do we stay relevant and give readers something that they can't get from the crowdsourced websites? And this is something that I've been exploring, is that context, the expert people that weigh in, the research that is done. Context just makes food taste so much better. When you track the journey that food takes to get to the plate, you can help readers connect deeper, like I said, with other cultures. And food is just like loaded with tons of backstories. For instance, you can discuss what the history of a dish is. Is there a tradition behind the dish? You know, is it made for particular celebrations, holidays, festivals? We just had Mardi Gras, and a famous dish for Mardi Gras is the king cake, where they put the little baby doll in the cake, and well, whoever gets the baby is considered lucky, but they also have to buy next year's king cake, and they have to organize next year's Mardi Gras party. So like with that cake comes responsibility. So there, you know, that's a little example of that. That you could also ask, like, who are the people that are keeping these culinary traditions alive? For instance, I used to live in Germany, and so I've gone back multiple times. I dated a German guy for 3 years, and I've gone back to visit friends. I go back for work, and last year I went back to Bavaria, and I visited the northern region. When you think of Bavaria, you think of like beer and lederhosen and sausages. And so yeah, everything that you would quintessentially think is German is kind of found in Bavaria. But in the northern part, in Franconia, there's actually this 1,000-year-old wine region that, after having lived there and visited there multiple times, I had no idea. And I wasn't even really like looking for a wine region, but it was really interesting to hear the stories of the people that are like my age, entering their 30s. They're taking over their parents' vineyards, and they are reimagining, and they're carrying on this tradition that's like 1,000 years old, but watching them apply new technologies and new kind of fermenting techniques to this old style of wine. The wine is called the Sylvaner, by the way. It's like an effervescent, sweet white wine. I'm not a white wine person personally, but I really, really enjoyed it, and I enjoyed it even more knowing the history and the culture behind it, because context makes food delicious. You could think about, you know, how a tradition remains intact as it travels across the world. Living in Philadelphia, and I don't know, how many people are here in New York? Is there anyone from Philadelphia? Yeah. This is how small of a town Philadelphia is. Jill and I knew one another from when we both lived in Philadelphia, and I had no idea that you were going to be here today. But yes, so, you know, I really respect when I go to a immigrant restaurant in Philadelphia and I see that they've kept their cuisine intact. That's such like an amazing gift, but also the journey that food had to take to get to Philadelphia. You know, I just deeply respect the fact that they're sharing their cultural tradition with us in our home cities, but also that they were able to keep a lot of the flavors consistent with flavors from their home countries. So that can be kind of like a story angle that you could explore. One of the things that I really love to do is like considering the influences. I love like thinking about the history, like how historical moments can actually influence food. Something that I've been looking into nowadays is like what the Great Depression did to food, and some really wacky dishes come out of that era, but it's like dishes born out of desperation. You've got things like the mayonnaise and peanut butter sandwich that like got popular on Twitter like last year. There's things like chipped corned beef, the SOS as it's called in Pennsylvania, the kind of like sloppy white gravy on toast with the corn chip beef. That's from the Great Depression. Rocky Road ice cream is from the Great Depression. And another fun story to look into is like candy was considered recession and depression proof. So there's like great stories about how different candy stores actually like flourished during this time, during the Great Depression. So just like thinking about food from a different perspective, but also what are the other cultural influences that make the dish uniquely that dish? So usually food is like an amalgamation of like several cultures combined that have either traveled across country borders or have, like, for instance, in Israel, Israeli cuisine is like a fascinating thing to explore. And it's hard to kind of pin down because it's just hundreds of cultures that have been in that region for thousands of years, just all kind of mixing together. But a really interesting story that kind of talks about cultural influence on a particular dish. In this case, it's going to be on American style whiskey. I recently learned this on a podcast that I listened to called Gastropod. They actually discovered that, so Jack Daniels, everyone knows what Jack Daniels is, Jack Daniels Tennessee whiskey. Well, the story used to be that Jack Daniels had learned to make whiskey from Dan Call, who was a pastor in Lynchburg, Tennessee. That story is actually false. Researchers discovered that Jack Daniels actually learned to distill from a enslaved African whose name was Nearest Green. And they know his name is Nearest Green because it wasn't the Jack Daniels family had written him out of the history. It was someone else along the lines when Jack Daniels kind of became largely distributed, that somewhere between 1967 and 2016, Nearest Green was forgotten, but he was actually celebrated in Jack Daniels' biography. So there was a fantastic journalist, an African-American woman named Fawn Weaver. She actually bought the Jack Daniels farm down in Lynchburg, Tennessee, and she started to do all of this research. And in her research, come to find out, she, like, unbeknownst to her until she did her research, she found out that she bought what was the first location for Jack Daniels whiskey, but also had discovered that Nearest Green was Jack Daniels' first master distiller. So the first master distiller of Jack Daniels is an enslaved African by the name of Nearest Green. And so that completely rewrites history of American whiskey as we know it. And so they were able to also make the connection that the charcoal filtration, the thing that makes American whiskey uniquely American and gives it that, like, kind of sweet flavor, was a technique that was from West Africa. So the technique of charcoal filtration traveled across the Atlantic through slaves. And the thing that makes American whiskey uniquely American is heavily influenced by the African culture, specifically the West African culture. Yes?
Did you write about this for USA Today?
No, I just listened to it on a pod. I just love these types of stories. No, yeah, it's a little, like, sometimes, believe it or not, sometimes, like, I will actually go and write way more in-depth pieces for other people, just because, like, you can touch on it at USA Today, on our vertical at 10 Best. Like, I can touch on those things, but I really like to get into the nitty-gritty. But that was just kind of an example to share with you, like, hey, food writing, like I said, is not about food. It's like these deeper contextual stories and these histories that, you know, make you think about food in a different way, that, like, dispel your, you know, what you previously believed about that food to be true. So those are just some angles to kind of consider. That's, like, just an example of the context and the histories and the stories that you could explore, aside from just, like, what to eat and where to eat it, or in this case, where to drink whiskey. Anyway, but a big ingredient of any food story is identity. And so while you're thinking about your context and what context you'll be exploring, it's really important to consider the who is that story about and who is telling that story. And these are two conditions that can mean drastic differences in the kinds of stories that are going to come out. And this step requires you to know a lot about yourself and who you are as the writer, and if or even when it's appropriate to inject yourself into the story by any means. So before we can examine, like, the kind of who's, we need to examine ourselves. So I studied anthropology, and one of the first things you learn to do is a self-analysis that's called reflexivity. And reflexivity is just kind of like a fancy term for just being brutally honest with yourself and knowing what your background is, examining, what religion you grew up with, where you grew up, what your blind spots may be, what your privileges are, what your biases are, and everything about your background and your experiences that are going to shape the lens through which you perceive the world. Because without doing this practice of self-awareness, your personal influences are going to impact your observations and your interpretations of your interviews. And that could potentially contaminate your story with false assumptions that confirm your bias. I know that's like a lot of social science terms that I just laid out there, but we've all heard about confirmation bias and how we all do it. It's just like a really natural thing that we do. Everything that we perceive is filtered through a lens that has been shaped by all of our past experiences, and we judge our world based off of what we already know about it. But this practice of reflexivity, we need to really understand that everything we know is not all that there is to know about a particular concept or about the world that we live in. And reflexivity can help with that. It can help you observe a little bit more clearly because it requires you to examine how your personal influences may impact the story. Am I going too fast or is everyone okay? I see everyone like scrolling, like taking notes. So this practice of self-awareness can like help you become a little bit more open to observations that might not fit in with your personal beliefs, and they might prove your assumptions wrong. And that's an amazing thing. It's awesome to be wrong. Being wrong is great because then you can be open to what is true and what is real. And it gets you closer to the truth, and it can help expand your bubble, expand your understanding, and expand your experiences and your, add more perception to your world. Because science and journalism isn't about proving who is right or what is right. It's about finding the truth. And that's what we should all be striving to do. And reflexivity isn't something that you're just going to do once and be like, yay, my assignment is done for Anthro 101. I'm ready to move on to cultural anthropology now. No, that's something that you have to do throughout the course of a project, throughout the course of your career. It's essentially professional imposter syndrome. You're constantly going to be questioning yourself and your reality and what you know to be true. But that's okay. And these things will change as you grow and as you develop. But the whole point is to just never become blind to who you are as an individual. So when I'm approaching my own personal food stories, I'm approaching it like a social scientist. And when I assign people stories, I'm also hoping that they approach it like a social scientist as well, because that's kind of what we do. But let's consider these who questions. Who is that story about and who is telling that story? Of course, it's you telling the story, but you have to understand what your relationship is to that story. Are you part of the culture that you are discussing? And if not, have you spent time with that culture and have you researched the topic heavily? If the answer to those questions are no or grim, then possibly you might not be the person to tell this story at this time. And I say at this time because there could be a point in the future where you build a rapport with this culture a little bit more, you gain more contacts, you have more resources, you spend a little bit more time. Yes?
But isn't it true that you can use interviews to supplement that?
Right, I'm getting into that. I'm getting into it. That's your resources. That's your resources. No worries. No, that's fine. Okay, so you don't have to know everything, but you just have to know that you don't know everything and that you're going to try your best to find the right people who do know more than you do about a certain topic. So yes, that was my point. The next who is telling that story, it very well might be that who is telling that story are the people that you're interviewing, the locals of a place, the chefs that you're profiling, the experts, scientists that are researching that subject. But another important who to consider is that person a good representative of that culture? Are they, should they be seen as the authority? Or perhaps is there another perspective that could be leveraged that's not being talked about already in the space for perhaps people of color, women, LGBTQ community, some perspectives that are going to give us a little bit more information that we're not already getting on a particular topic. So that's another thing to consider with the who's. I hope I hit all my who questions. I wrote out notes. Like, there's only so many times like you could practice this in front of the cat before you're like, cat doesn't give you feedback. Anyway, and I say that these who questions are really important because there are a lot of like subtle nuances in these stories of food, because food is so closely tied to identity, the identity of people and the identity of a place. And you have to be really careful because you might accidentally gloss over something that needs to be discussed and needs to be talked about. So yes, by glossing over these, it would be a huge disservice to not just your readers, but the cultures in which we're discussing. So, I've been learning this as I've been also personally going on through my career. I've had writers who are very talented who, pitched me really ambitious ideas. And then I said, yeah, go for it. And then when I got the piece in, I could tell that they kind of struggled with the topic because they just weren't equipped to tackle the story. They didn't have the resources or the right people to interview. They didn't have a relationship or rapport already with the topic. And so then it's work for me, but it's my job, to kind of go in and be like, hey, this needs to be elaborated a little bit more. Or, hey, this is an opportunity to maybe like research a little bit further, interview a local, interview a chef, interview a scientist. But then that also means more work for the writer because then they have to go through those edits and they have to continue and do more research. And we all know like editorial fees are kind of low right now. So it's just kind of like trying to figure out a good hourly rate, and having to go back and do that level of work isn't advantageous. It's not a good use of time for anyone. So like, that's what I try to do. That's my level of responsibility, to make sure that when a piece comes through my desk, it's responsible and it tells the appropriate information. And also too, I have to consider who is the right person to tell that story. Because as we're going to explore, I have a few examples because I understand that that's like a really complex concept. But yeah, the who is important to how you approach and present a story. You just really have to consider how that story is being presented. And like I said before, you don't have to know everything. You just have to know that you don't and find the right people who do. Because in anthropology, we used to joke around that like it was the study of proving that you don't know anything, because you're constantly taking your own personal lens through which you observe the world and just like smashing it so that you can try and perceive the world from another perspective. And you're just acknowledging that your reality is different than other people's reality. So I know that's complex, so let's go through some examples. Does anyone, I'm sorry, someone said that they liked Bon Appetit. I like Bon Appetit too, but Bon Appetit did have like a really bad mistake back in 2014, or 2016 rather, when it came to discussing another culture's food. Does anyone remember the pho shop in Philadelphia? That Bon Appetit? No. Wow. Okay. So I'll give you the little overview. Jill remembers. Yeah. So there's a pho shop in Fishtown in Philadelphia, and it's owned by a white man named Tyler Aiken. And so Bon Appetit came in and they wanted to do a story about pho. And so they decided they wanted to interview Tyler. And so they only interviewed Tyler. And so they positioned Tyler as the authority of pho, that he was the representative of this culture's dish. They also did a video with him where he talks about how you should season pho, how to eat pho, educating us as if, he's the right person to be telling us how to eat and enjoy pho. The title of the piece was also Pho is the New Ramen, which was like right off the bat, just two cultures completely minimized to food trends. Like, it was like saying pho is the new chicken noodle soup. Like that's goofy. That's ridiculous. They're two wildly different things. So in that story, it was problematic for many, many reasons. One, oh, thank you. 10 minutes, really? Oh, 15. Okay, thank you. Awesome. Anyway, yeah, so it was problematic because the title just minimized, several cultures. They should have considered who they were picking to present pho as a cuisine. They should have interviewed a Vietnamese chef. Like this, for instance, I used this NPR article, which was a response to that situation, because it was just a better story and I didn't want to perpetuate the Bon Appetit story. But if you want to read more about it, go to The Salt. This was written by a Vietnamese woman, and she used that as an opportunity to discuss the importance of pho to the Vietnamese cultural identity. Because it's more than food. Like I said before, it is people's history, it's people's cultures. And so we have to be really cautious about that. Another thing with the Bon Appetit story was they positioned Tyler as the authority and as the expert on another culture's cuisine, which he should have never had that much say in that story. But the most disturbing part of all of that was how many hands that story had to go through in order to get published. I just imagine that story had to be discussed at a writer's table, an editor approved it, someone edited the video, there was a social media person that was probably prepped and knew that story was coming along the line. And so out of all those people, no one stopped that story from happening. And so, which tells me that they probably have no people of color working within that organization that would have caught that error, that said, hey, you know what, we could talk about pho, but not like this. And if they do have, marginalized people within their organization, they're not listening to them, clearly. I'm sure this is now 3 years ago, 3 years ago at this point. They took the story back, wrote a huge apology. Whether or not they've learned, I'm not sure. But better example, bam, who watched Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat on Netflix? Yes, love her, she's amazing. This is a positive example. This is how to discuss a culture that you're not particularly from. Samin Nosrat, she is an Iranian-American food writer and chef, and this is a photo from the Salt episode, which takes place in Japan. So she uses a lot of women experts, she uses a lot of scientists in the field, and she does a really good job incorporating really valuable voices that add a different perspective to the conversation that isn't already being discussed. And her and herself, she's just, she does what I call curiosity, not authority. She approaches these topics and these stories with curiosity. Whereas the Tyler story, he approached pho with authority. And so she does a really good job because she has a great understanding of food and ingredients and the science of cooking and the techniques of cooking. So she does a really good job, speaking to her expertise, but then she asks questions of the people that she's interviewing and of the people that she's featuring on her show, and she takes a step back and lets them shine. She's an incredibly talented person, and she's also just so humble and open to learning, and that's how you should be approaching these food stories. Moving on, because we only have a few minutes. Ghee. Ghee has been an Indian staple for millennia, and now the rest of the world is catching on. So this is a great example. The piece is written by an Indian woman, and she's talking about the food from her perspective, from her culture. So, she begins the piece with her experiences with ghee as a baby. And then it's followed by an overview of how ghee is culturally significant to the Indian culture, its appearances in Hindu mythology, its uses in Ayurvedic medicine, and how it has these incredible anti-inflammatory properties, and how ghee is used in celebrations like wedding ceremonies, but also during funerals. And so you get this beautiful overview of how ghee is culturally significant. And it's a little bit more interesting and it connects you more to ghee than the general, ghee is the next big ingredient, clarified butter. It's a lot more interesting. She also ties in a really great historical lesson in this story where she talks about the dairy surplus in the 1950s and how with the dairy surplus in the United States, they actually tried to make ghee. They tried to mass produce ghee and then sell it back to India, but it didn't succeed because the preference of ghee varies throughout the country. So in order to meet the demand of ghee, they would have had to satiate all the variety of palettes of ghee in India. So that project ultimately failed. But this piece ends. I love the historical context. So you're getting all this understanding of ghee, and so this author gifts us at the end of this piece. She gifts us with a recipe for ghee. So how to bring ghee into your own home. So that is a really great, example of talking about a culture that you're from. She is, with stories like that, that's a level of authority that you're just not going to be able to get from anywhere else. So moral of the story, since I'm kind of like running through, more perspectives makes the experience and discussion just better for everyone. Food writing isn't just about food. It's history, it's traditions, it's people's livelihoods. It's what sustains societies and cultures. Before currency, civilizations exchanged food, which turned into markets, which turned into trade routes, which turned into global economies. And food has motivated exploration. It has fueled conquests, which has led to great disparities in power and wealth and equity in our world. So when we talk about food writing, it's not just an opportunity to talk about the glamour of cuisine. It's an opportunity to rewrite the histories that have erased the outstanding contributions and innovations of marginalized people, and to give credit where credit is due. Food writing is an opportunity to dispel misconceptions and biases that other people may have against other people or other cultures. And food writing is also an opportunity to show the next generation that you don't have to be a white man to be a chef or a distiller or a brewmaster or a farmer or a food writer or a food critic. So to seize these opportunities, we need to make sure that we bring more perspectives into these conversations, and by including more voices, whether they are writers of color, women writers, LGBTQ writers, or people that we are also interviewing in this field, when we're adding those voices, we develop more thorough stories and we expand our understanding, not just of food and of the world, but of each other. Because even though we have all these amazing, wonderful differences, we all can relate to one thing, and we all eat. We all eat. Food is a universal language. It's a common ground to meet people that are different from you and to create some type of mutual respect and develop an understanding. So this is why it's extremely crucial for food media, whether we be freelancers or editors or influencers or bloggers or wherever medium you're sharing these food stories on, we take this seriously and we approach these stories responsibly, because when we are more responsible, we take the time to self-reflect and understand our position in the world and the other, the food and the cultures that we're discussing, we can influence our readers to do the same. So thank you. Does anyone have questions? Yes. Oh, wait, I think we need to form a line. Are we okay?
Yeah, whatever you want to ask them, just come up.
Yeah. We can share the mic.
I just had a quick one for the reflexivity test.
Yes.
Is there a resource for
I mean, it's just like a self-analysis. You could look up reflexivity, and I'm sure there might be like fielded questions, but it's just taking a moment to like do almost like a self-bio and recognize that the way that you were raised, the community that you grew up in, the religion that you also grew up in, and all of your past experiences are just going to have some level of impact on your take on the world, on your perspective. Yeah, but it's an exercise, and it's not that it's like formal. Like there are formal things that you can do, but it's just the act of understanding. Like if you read any anthropological like textbooks, or when someone does like an anthropological research, like the first couple of chapters are literally reflexivity on the author's part, so that you as the reader can also know like, oh, you know what? Because no matter how hard you try, we're all humans. We will have flaws. Bias will slip through. And it's just to try and not contaminate your story as much as possible. Yes. Yes.
What did you think then about Anthony Bourdain?
Oh.
Like his
Like what specifically? How he approached it?
Yeah,
Uh,
didn't he try to get into the culture?
he did. But he always did a. Oh, okay. So the question was how Anthony Bourdain approached food and what I and his reporting style. I felt as though he took the time and he was extremely respectful, but he knew when to step away and not speak. The whole point is not speaking for that culture, but allowing that culture to kind of speak for itself through those interviews and through through the experts and their research, but just trying not to take that voice away. And I felt as though he created a wonderful platform for a lot of those stories to come through. Yes, in the back.
If you are considering your emphasis on the importance of food, if you are a brand that publishes like under the byline of the brand, do you think that you can ever really tell great stories because you're not identifying an author, you're like a brand author?
So the question was, can you create a level of authenticity if you're publishing under a brand and the brand kind of takes the byline?
Yeah.
I mean, who's getting paid? Like, that's kind of what matters too, because no matter who, like you're writing that piece, I think there can still be responsibility and authenticity in that work if you are making an effort to say, hey, I want to write about Alaskan salmon. Let me actually source that article from either someone that knows a lot about it or maybe a fisherman or someone that's close to that community and allowing them to write that piece. I mean, that just like as an example, but even though they're not getting like the publicity, the public byline, they're the person that wrote the article. They're the person that gave that piece a voice. And hopefully they're the one that gets paid. Yes.
I guess over the years, I've seen so many stories about chefs like the guy in Philly. I mean, but I also see that even in like Julia Child or going back, people who are English speakers or Westerners bringing cultures that are not native to themselves foods into the West or to the U.S. and kind of being the person that tells that story about that food.
Yeah.
And I'm just I've always been a little bit conflicted about it because I feel like, why do you position yourself as the authority and yet also grateful because how else would we know about that food if they hadn't come and talked about it?
Yeah, that's a tough conversation, and it is like a case by case kind of, you got to analyze it case by case, in the sense that if it's someone who actually took the time and built a relationship, like Julia Child lived in France, and her villa is like still there, I presume, because I saw photos of that amazing kitchen. Was really jealous, but of the writer that actually got to stay in that house and write that piece. I think it was in the New York Times. But when that person has spent a significant time with that culture, they are giving credit to that culture. They are also giving back to that culture, whether it be in like a monetary way or hiring that people of that culture within their kitchens. If they seem to be doing that level of respect, then it's tough case by case, but also too, has it inspired you to go seek out more of that cuisine? Was like, for instance, Tyler's a bad example, but if someone discovered pho at his pho shop, I would hope that they would go and explore real pho, like pho that's not made by a white dude. That maybe they would go down to, we have a whole neighborhood in Philadelphia that has a huge, thriving Vietnamese community. And there are tons of better pho shops that are, no offense to stock, but like I just don't like that place. But anyway, yeah, like I would hope that they would eat the Americanized version of the food and go, I want to explore more. I want to get closer to this culture. Let me go try something that might be a little bit more authentic and go to that or travel to that country. That would be cool. Yes, Kelsey.
I'm curious about your personal best places to recommend to write about?
Oh goodness, my own personal journey.
Do you have,
It.
like, your first podcast or first publications that you always read?
Oh
that
yeah.
help you set up your
Thank you. So the question was, what are some of my first places that I like to go to research before I go on like a trip or before I go on an assignment? Yeah, I love Gastropod. Those women explore the science and history of food very deeply. I like The Sporkful with Dan Pashman, but he mostly speaks to communities mostly around the New York area. Gosh, what else? I think Afar is pretty good. Oh, Savor is also really good. But I also will try and find like Instagrammers and Twitter accounts from that country of origin and like kind of explore like what are they doing? Like kind of creep. I'm a creep. Just creep on their social. Like where are they eating? What are they, what are they exploring? Because we might think that this is another interesting topic is like cultures also morph over time and they evolve over time. Like Philadelphia, for instance, coming from Philadelphia, like our local food is like a cheesesteak, right? But it's been really interesting to see that like a lot of Philadelphians don't really eat the cheesesteak anymore. We're on to other dishes already. So like what are Philadelphians nowadays eating? Are they eating hoagies more often? I eat hoagies more often. But yeah, like kind of exploring where that culture has come and then like, hey, where is it heading? What's the contemporary? Do we have any more questions or?
Time's actually up.
Okay. Yes. But I'll be around if anyone has any other questions. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.